Crash! The sound of metal twisting and wood splintering echoed down my street like a thunderclap. I rushed outside just in time to see Karen Whitmore, our self-appointed HOA queen, stumbling out of her prized Range Rover, staring in disbelief at what used to be my fence. Only this time the fence was still standing, and her SUV was the one in ruins. Smoke hissed from the hood, her bumper hung off like a loose tooth, and my neighbors peeked out from their porches gasping, whispering, even laughing under their breath. For weeks, Karen thought she could plow through my property like it was her personal shortcut, daring me to stop her. Well, she finally hit the wall, literally, and trust me, it wasn't luck. Want to know how one quiet homeowner turned a simple fence into Karen's worst nightmare? Stick around because this is the story of the trap that wrecked her car. But first, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Let's see how far this tale of karma travels. When I first moved into our neighborhood, I thought I had found a slice of the American dream. You know the picture, quiet streets where kids ride their bikes without fear, neighbors who wave politely as they mow their lawns, and tidy little homes that look like they'd been plucked straight out of a suburban postcard. My house wasn't the biggest on the block, and I didn't have the flashiest yard ornaments, but I had something I was proud of: my fence. Now before you laugh, let me explain. That fence wasn't just a row of wooden boards hammered into the ground. It was the result of months of sweat planning and late evenings with a hammer in one hand and a cold beer in the other. I designed it myself, built it from sturdy pine, and painted it a crisp white that practically glowed in the sunday. It wasn't fancy, but it framed my yard perfectly and gave me that feeling every homeowner craves: this is mine. For a while, life was peaceful. I'd sit on my porch in the evenings watching the sun dip behind the rooftops, sipping coffee while my dog Max lounged near the gate. I kept my lawn trimmed, my garden neat, and my fence straight. And for a few months, no one had anything to complain about. That peace didn't last long. You see, in every neighborhood, there's always one person who seems to think the rules are written only for everyone else. In our community, that person was Karen Whitmore. Picture a woman in her late 50s, designer sunglasses glued to her face, a perpetual sneer tugging at her lips, and an SUV so big it could rival a tank. Karen wasn't just any resident. She was on the HOA board. Worse yet, she carried herself like she was the queen of the HOA. Untouchable, unchallenged, and convinced the entire neighborhood revolved around her whims. At first, I didn't pay her much attention. She had her clique of friends who whispered during board meetings, her habit of posting passive-aggressive notes on community bulletin boards, and her endless parade of rules about aesthetics. Fine. If she wanted to obsess over how high someone's grass was or whether a mailbox leaned 2 inches too far, that was her problem. But then she turned her sights on me. It started with comments. She'd slow down her SUV as she drove past my house, roll down the tinted window, and call out, "That fence looks a little off-white. Don't you think HOA guidelines prefer eggshell?" Or she'd corner me at the mailbox, wagging a manicured finger at the boards. "Did you measure the spacing correctly? We wouldn't want to violate symmetry standards." I'd smile, nod politely, and walk away, telling myself she was just bored and needed a hobby. But then she escalated. One morning, I woke up to the sound of Max barking furiously in the yard. I walked out, coffee mug in hand, only to find my fence leaning awkwardly, a section of it splintered and broken. At first, I thought maybe it had been a storm, though there hadn't been one. Then I saw deep tire tracks cutting across the grass, leading straight through the broken boards. I didn't have to guess. I already knew who it was. Later that day, I saw her, Karen, smug as ever, steering her shiny black Range Rover down her driveway. And instead of using the street like every other decent human being, she casually cut across my yard through the gap in the fence, bouncing over the grass as if it were her private shortcut. She gave me the most insincere little wave, the kind that said, "What are you going to do about it?" I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. You'd think anyone with a shred of decency would apologize, maybe even offer to pay for repairs. Not Karen. She doubled down. The next HOA meeting, she stood there in front of the entire board and announced, "We really should address unsightly damage to fences in the neighborhood. It drags down property values." And then she had the gall to look directly at me as if I were the one at fault. I filed a complaint with the HOA, complete with photos of the tire tracks and the smashed boards. The response, a polite but dismissive letter saying they'd look into it. A week later, I received an official notice in the mail: violation, fence in disrepair. Fine, $200. I nearly choked. Not only had she destroyed my fence, but now the HOA, her HOA, was fining me for it. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I wasn't just annoyed anymore. I wasn't just angry. No, this had become personal. Karen had made a mockery of me in front of my neighbors, wrecked something I had built with my own 2 hands, and then laughed in my face while fining me for the privilege. Every time I looked at that broken fence, every time I caught her smirk as she drove past, I felt my blood pressure rise. But here's the thing, I'm not the kind of man who acts on impulse. No, I've learned in life that the sweetest revenge isn't loud and it isn't quick. It's quiet, patient, and precise. I started watching Karen more closely. Her routine was predictable. Morning yoga at the community center, afternoon shopping trips, evening HOA patrols where she cruised around in her Range Rover, looking for violations to report. And more than once, I saw her cut across my property like it was a public road. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't careless. It was deliberate. That's when I began thinking if she wanted to make my fence her personal driveway, maybe it was time the fence fought back. I didn't know how just yet, but I knew one thing for certain, Karen had just declared war and I wasn't about to lose. The first time Karen drove through my fence, I told myself it was a one-off. Maybe she'd been distracted, maybe she'd taken the wrong angle backing out of her driveway. Heck, maybe she'd even been late for her yoga class and decided a shortcut was worth it. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. I really did. But when I repaired, the fence spent an entire Saturday hammering, sawing, repainting, and saw her plow through it again the following week, laughing into her Bluetooth headset as if nothing happened. I knew I wasn't dealing with an accident. I was dealing with arrogance. She made it a habit. Twice a week, sometimes more, I'd find fresh damage, broken slats, tire marks gouged into my lawn, splinters scattered like confetti. Every time I fixed the fence, it was like she took it as a challenge, an open invitation to test her Range Rover's bumper against my property, and every time she'd win. At first I tried civility. I caught her one morning as she was unloading groceries. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice calm, "you've been driving through my fence. I need you to stop." She didn't even blink. "Oh, please, Mark. It's barely a fence, just a few boards nailed together. Honestly, it looks like a public pathway. If you wanted privacy, you should have built something sturdier." Her tone dripped with condescension, like I was some naive child who didn't understand the big, bad world of HOA regulations. She adjusted her sunglasses, gave me a fake smile, and added, "Besides, you should be thanking me. I'm adding character to your property." Character. That word rattled in my head long after she disappeared into her house. Character was not what she was adding, chaos was. So I did what any reasonable homeowner would do. I took it to the HOA. I filed my complaint with photos, dates, even a video I'd managed to capture of her SUV bulldozing through like a wrecking ball. I sat at the board meeting waiting for justice, expecting them to at least reprimand her. Instead, Karen sat across the table, arms crossed, smirking as the board president shuffled through my paperwork. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "we appreciate you bringing this to our attention. However, property line disputes fall into a bit of a gray area." Gray area. It was my fence. On my land. Destroyed by one of their own board members. What part of that was gray? Karen leaned forward, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Mark, maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe the problem is your fence. It's just not very HOA friendly. Perhaps if you built something more in line with community standards, it wouldn't be so easy to accidentally damage." The board nodded along, like sheep jotting notes about aesthetic violations and safety concerns. By the end of the meeting, instead of Karen being fined for destruction, I walked out with a violation notice for damaged fence visible to the public. That night, I sat on my porch staring at the broken boards. Max whined beside me, sensing my frustration. The injustice gnawed at me. I wasn't just fighting Karen. I was fighting an entire system that seemed rigged in her favor. And Karen knew it. She grew bolder. She didn't just drive through my fence, she made a spectacle of it. Once, while I was barbecuing in the backyard with a few friends, she barreled through, sending wood flying, then waved at us like she was the guest of honor. My buddies stood there, slack-jawed, burgers in hand, while Karen revved her engine and disappeared down the street. Another time, she slowed down right after smashing through, rolled down her window, and called out, "Might want to get that fixed. Mark HOA doesn't like eyesores." Then she sped off, her laughter echoing like nails on a chalkboard. It was humiliating. Every time my fence lay in ruins, it wasn't just my property she was wrecking, it was my dignity. Neighbors started whispering. Some pitied me, others found it amusing. I even overheard one guy joke at the mailbox. At this point, Mark should just install a drive-through sign. The worst part, the costs. Lumber isn't cheap, paint isn't cheap, and my weekends certainly aren't free. Yet there I was, again and again, shelling out money and sweat just to restore what she'd destroyed days later. And all the while, HOA kept sending me fines for unrepaired damage. It was like I was living in a comedy skit written by a sadist. But beneath the frustration, something else was growing. A resolve. I started keeping a journal documenting every incident, snapping photos from different angles, cataloging dates and times. Not because I thought HOA would care, but because I knew one day I'd need the receipts. I needed to be ready. And every time Karen's SUV roared through my fence, I reminded myself she was building her own downfall, one arrogant shortcut at a time. She thought she was untouchable, but she was wrong. The more she laughed, the more she mocked, the more I planned. Quietly, patiently. Because here's the thing about people like Karen, they never expect consequences. They think their power protects them, their titles shield them, their noise drowns out anyone else's voice. But all it takes is one well-placed strike, one carefully laid trap to bring the whole facade crashing down. And as I stood there repairing my fence for what felt like the 10th time, hammer in hand, sweat dripping down my back, I made myself a promise the next time Karen tried to plow through, she wouldn't be laughing. She'd be learning. It's funny how something as simple as a fence can eat away at you. Day by day, slat by slat, that white wooden barrier became a symbol of my humiliation. I'd walk outside every morning, cup of coffee in hand, and instead of peace, I'd be greeted by splinters and skid marks. My dog Max would sniff at the wreckage, tail low, as if even he knew we were living under siege. The worst part wasn't the destruction itself, it was the silence from everyone who should have had my back. The HOA board useless. My neighbors too scared of Karen to get involved. Even the city office brushed me off when I tried to file a complaint. "It's a civil matter, sir," the clerk told me, barely looking up from her screen. A civil matter. As if watching a grown woman weaponize her SUV against my property on a weekly basis was just some neighborly squabble over flower beds. Meanwhile, Karen strutted around like a peacock, relishing her role as queen of the cul-de-sac. Every HOA meeting became a platform for her little power plays. She'd wag her manicured finger and scold residents for leaving trash cans visible for planting flowers, not in the approved color scheme for parking 2 inches too close to a curb. But when it came to her, Karen was above it all. The hypocrisy was staggering, and it didn't take long before her campaign against me went public. One Saturday afternoon, I was out fixing the fence yet again when Karen pulled up window down, sunglasses perched like she was auditioning for a reality TV show. "Mark," she called, voice saccharine, "sweet, you really should consider rebuilding this whole thing. It's dragging down the neighborhood." I wiped the sweat from my forehead, glaring at her. Maybe if people stopped driving through it, it wouldn't look so bad. She smirked. "Accidents happen, but it's your responsibility to maintain your property. HOA rules are rules after all." Then she revved the engine and rolled away, leaving me clenching my hammer so tightly I nearly snapped the handle. The audacity burned in my chest. Every time she spoke, every time she mocked, I felt like I was the punchline of some twisted neighborhood joke. And I could see it in the eyes of a few neighbors who passed by pity. That subtle look that says, "Poor guy, Karen's got him beat." I wasn't just losing money on repairs. I was losing respect. But the moment that truly broke me came on a Sunday afternoon. My family had come over for a cookout, my sister, her husband, and my elderly father. We were all sitting out back enjoying burgers and beers when the familiar roar of Karen's engine pierced the air. Before I could even stand, she came barreling through the fence boards, flying like toothpicks. The car missed the porch by maybe 3 feet. My father, who had been sitting there with a glass of iced tea, dropped it, the liquid splashing across his shoes. His face went pale, his hands trembling. For one terrifying second, I thought that car was going to slam straight into him. Karen didn't even stop. She rolled down the street, her laughter echoing behind her like a taunt. That was it. That was the line. I stared at the wreckage, at the look of fear on my father's face, at my sister trying to calm him down, and something inside me hardened. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It wasn't even about me. It was about safety, about dignity, about finally standing up to someone who thought she was untouchable. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every insult, every splintered board, every smug grin. The rage simmered, but beneath it was a cold determination. I wasn't going to scream at her. I wasn't going to throw a rock through her window. No, I was going to do something much better. I was going to use her arrogance against her. Because here's the thing, when someone like Karen pushes and pushes, they expect you to eventually snap, to do something stupid they can use against you. That's their game. But what they never expect is patience. They never expect you to smile, nod, and quietly sharpen the knife while they hand you the rope to hang them with. So I started planning. At first it was just a fantasy, reinforcing the fence, installing spikes, digging trenches. I'd sketch ideas on napkins, scribble notes in my journal. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it didn't have to be a fantasy. There were legal ways to defend my property. All I had to do was find them. I pored over HOA bylaws, city ordinances, and property codes late into the night. It wasn't fun reading dry technical loaded with jargon, but I was hunting for a loophole, a weapon buried in the fine print. And when I found it, I almost laughed out loud. The rules were clear. Homeowners had full rights to reinforce and maintain their fences so long as the external appearance remained consistent with community standards. In other words, I could build the strongest, meanest, most indestructible fence on the planet as long as it still looked like a regular fence from the outside. And suddenly the humiliation, the frustration, the helplessness, they all began to fade. In their place came a sense of control, power. For the first time in months, I felt like I was no longer playing defense. I wasn't just going to fix the fence anymore. I was going to weaponize it. The night I discovered that little golden loophole in the HOA bylaws, I barely slept. It was like stumbling across a cheat code in a video game. Reinforce the fence, however, I wanted as long as it looked the same. That was practically an engraved invitation. Karen thought she was clever, thought she had me cornered with her influence on the board, but she had overlooked one thing: paper doesn't lie. Those bylaws were clear, and they were on my side. The next morning I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. No more hammering flimsy pine boards back into place, no more apologizing for the wreckage Karen left behind, no more playing the fool while my neighbors shook their heads. No, it was time for the fence to evolve. Time for it to stop being just a boundary and start being a statement. Step 1 was research. I dove into online forums, DIY videos, even called up a buddy of mine who used to work in construction. I needed materials, serious materials. Pine wasn't going to cut it anymore. What I needed was steel. Industrial-grade posts, the kind used for highway barriers. I'd sink them so deep into the ground that not even an earthquake could budge them. Then I'd sheath them in pine boards so the outside looked exactly the same as before. To the HOA, it would be nothing more than a compliant white-painted fence. To Karen's Range Rover, it would be a brick wall in disguise. I made a shopping list that looked more like I was preparing for a military operation. 8 steel posts, 10 feet long. Bags of quick-dry concrete. Pressure-treated pine boards to match the original fence. Heavy-duty screws and bolts. A few rose bushes with the nastiest thorns I could find at the local nursery. The rose bushes were my personal touch. Not only would they beautify the fence, always important for keeping the HOA at bay, but they'd also provide a little extra incentive for anyone trying to plow through again. Imagine stepping out of your car after smashing into my fence and finding yourself tangled in thorns. Step 2 was secrecy. If Karen caught wind of my plan, she'd try to shut it down. She had spies everywhere, nosy neighbors who would report back to her about the color of your curtains if she asked. So I worked late at night, long after most of the cul-de-sac had turned in. I'd switch off the porch lights, crank up a work lamp in the yard, and let the sound of crickets drown out the clang of steel and the scrape of shovels. Max, my loyal mutt, kept watch. Every time headlights appeared at the end of the street, he'd bark and I'd freeze like a kid caught sneaking cookies from the jar. But most nights it was quiet. Karen never suspected a thing. I started by digging. Each post hole went 4 feet deep, wide enough to swallow a small child. My back ached, my arms burned, and blisters sprouted on my palms, but every shovelful of dirt felt like progress. I poured in concrete, set the steel posts in place, and checked them with a level. They stood tall and immovable like silent sentinels waiting for orders. Next came the disguise. I wrapped the steel posts in pine boards carefully measured to match the spacing and paint of the rest of the fence. From the street it looked identical, another simple white fence, nothing to see here. But inside I knew it was stronger than a fortress wall. Finally, I planted the roses. Thick, thorny vines with blooms so red they almost looked like drops of blood in the moonlight. I wove them through the fence slats, trained them along the posts, and smiled to myself as the first thorns poked through the wood. Beauty and brutality side by side. HOA couldn't object to roses. They were practically begging for them in their endless landscaping memos. By the time I stepped back and admired my work, the sky was streaked with pink dawn. My clothes were ruined, my body sore, but my spirit had never felt lighter. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't just reacting, I was ready. And oh, I didn't stop there. I set up 2 discreet security cameras hidden among the bushes. One faced the fence directly, the other captured the street leading up to it. If Karen tried her usual stunt again, not only would she collide with my reinforced masterpiece, but I'd have the whole thing on film. No denials, no accidents, no twisting the truth at HOA meetings. Cold, hard evidence. Of course, I kept my poker face during the day. I smiled politely at Karen when we passed, waved casually to other neighbors, even fixed up a few old sections of the fence to make it look like I was still just repairing. Karen would sometimes slow her SUV as she passed sunglasses, glinting smirk plastered on her lips. She had no idea that beneath that fresh coat of white paint lurked a fence that would chew her Range Rover alive. And I'll admit, I allowed myself to savor the anticipation. Every time I walked past that stretch of fence, I pictured it: the crunch of metal against steel, the hiss of a punctured radiator, Karen's jaw dropping as she realized her shortcut had finally betrayed her. Revenge wasn't just coming, it was inevitable. I didn't know when Karen would strike again, but I knew she would. Her arrogance wouldn't let her stop, and when she did, I'd be ready. There's a certain electricity in the air when you know something is about to happen. You can feel it in your bones, a tension humming under your skin like the calm before a thunderstorm. That's how it felt in the days after I finished my reinforced fence. Every morning I woke up expecting to hear the familiar crunch of wood and the roar of Karen's engine. Every evening I went to bed wondering if tonight would be the night she finally handed me the satisfaction I'd been waiting for. And then one Saturday afternoon it happened. I was on my porch, coffee in hand, pretending to flip through the newspaper, but really just watching. Across the street, Karen's garage door rumbled open. Out came the black Range Rover, shiny as ever, its chrome gleaming like it thought it was invincible. I swear, the thing almost growled as it rolled onto the pavement as if it were a beast looking for its next victim. Karen was behind the wheel, of course, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose hair, perfectly coiffed, her lips pursed in that permanent scowl of entitlement. She didn't even glance my way. Why would she? In her mind, she owned this neighborhood. She could drive wherever she pleased, through whoever's property she pleased, and no one could touch her. She revved the engine once, twice, like a bull pawing the ground before a charge. And then without hesitation, she turned her wheel aimed directly at the section of my fence she'd smashed so many times before and hit the gas. I'll never forget the sound. It wasn't the familiar snap of wood breaking or the pitiful groan of nails giving way. No, this time it was different. It was a deep metallic clang, followed by the horrific shriek of steel grinding against steel. The Range Rover jolted violently, like it had slammed into an immovable wall, which in a way it had. The front bumper crumpled, instantly folding in on itself like paper. The airbags exploded, with a muffled whump filling the cabin with white clouds. Karen's sunglasses flew off her face as she let out a shriek that could probably be heard 3 streets over. The roses did their part too. Their thorns raked across the paint, carving jagged lines into the glossy black finish. Branches snapped under the impact, scattering petals and leaves that fluttered through the air like confetti at some twisted celebration. For once, it wasn't my fence lying in pieces. It was her car. Neighbors came pouring out of their homes like spectators rushing to a fireworks show. Phones came up immediately. This was the kind of neighborhood drama you don't just watch, you record. I could already picture the captions on social media: HOA Queen meets her match. I stood from my porch, heart pounding, and walked slowly toward the wreck. I wanted to savor every second. There was Karen, staggering out of the driver's seat, hair disheveled, her designer blouse streaked with dirt from the airbag dust. Her face was flushed with fury and embarrassment, and she had tiny scratches across her arms where the rose thorns had reached in to claim their prize. "What the hell did you do?" she screeched at me, pointing a trembling finger like she was casting a spell. I raised my eyebrows, fighting the grin tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Me, looks like you finally underestimated a fence." The neighbors laughed openly this time. Not the hushed chuckles behind closed doors, but real belly laughs, the kind you can't hold back. For months, Karen had strutted around untouchable, and now here she was standing in front of a mangled SUV, her kingdom reduced to rubble by a few steel posts and a bit of creativity. Karen's face twisted with rage. She stomped over to the wreck, kicking at the fence, expecting it to fall like always. It didn't budge. The clang of her designer heel against steel only made her look more ridiculous. "You set me up," she spat, glaring at me, as if I'd committed some grand crime. I shrugged. "I reinforced my fence. Perfectly legal. Want to see the paperwork?" That was when I saw it, the flicker of doubt in her eyes. For the first time, Karen realized she might not be in control of the narrative anymore. The crowd grew thicker. Kids pointed, adults whispered, cameras zoomed in on the damage. The Range Rover's front end looked like it had gone 12 rounds with a wrecking ball. Fluids dripped onto the pavement, a dark pool spreading beneath the car. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, their petals redder than ever, like they were celebrating the victory. Karen, of course, tried to salvage her dignity. She straightened her blouse, lifted her chin, and turned to the neighbors. "He's dangerous. He booby-trapped his fence to hurt me." The laughter that followed was louder this time. One of the neighbors, an older man named Jenkins, called out, "Booby-trapped lady, you drove straight into his yard. What did you expect? A welcome mat." I nearly lost it. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She pointed at me again, sputtering about lawsuits and HOA violations, but the damage was done. The queen had been dethroned. And me. For the first time in months, I felt a surge of pure, unfiltered satisfaction. I hadn't lifted a finger against her. I hadn't broken a single law. I'd simply given my fence a backbone. And Karen, in all her arrogance, had delivered her own punishment. I leaned casually against the fence, crossing my arms. "Well, Karen," I said loud enough for the crowd to hear, "guess the shortcut's closed." The laughter erupted again, and Karen's face turned scarlet. She stormed back toward her wrecked car, muttering curses under her breath. But no matter what she said, no matter how she spun it, everyone had seen the truth. The fence had won. It didn't take long for Karen to shift from humiliation to fury. If there's one thing an HOA queen can't stand, it's being laughed at. She stood there, surrounded by neighbors, snickering into their phones, her Range Rover bleeding fluids onto the street, and me leaning smugly against my fence, her face twisted like she'd just bitten into a lemon, soaked in vinegar. "This is an outrage," she screamed, pointing at me, as if I'd personally pushed her SUV into the steel posts. "He set a trap. This is a violation of every HOA regulation. He's endangering the entire neighborhood." The crowd didn't buy it. If anything, their laughter grew louder. But Karen wasn't one to back down. She pulled out her phone and barked into it like she was ordering an airstrike. Within minutes, I saw a familiar figure striding down the sidewalk, Richard Langley, the HOA president. Now, Richard was a tall, thin man in his 60s who always looked like he'd been ironed that morning. Perfectly pressed khakis polo tucked just right, clipboard in hand, like it was surgically attached. Normally, he carried himself with the calm authority of a man who enjoyed being in charge of petty neighborhood disputes. But as he approached the chaos unfolding in front of my house, I could see the beads of sweat forming at his temples. Karen rushed to him, clutching his arm dramatically. "Richard, thank God you're here. This lunatic has turned his fence into a death trap. Look at what he's done to my car. You have to fine him, expel him something." Richard blinked, adjusting his glasses as his eyes moved from Karen's mangled SUV to my perfectly intact fence. Then he looked at me, still leaning casually against the boards, arms folded like I was posing for a victory portrait. "Mark," he said carefully, "what exactly happened here?" I smiled politely. "What happened is Karen drove through my property again. Except this time the fence didn't roll over and die. It stood its ground. And before you ask, yes, I have the paperwork." I pulled a folder from under my arm, the same folder I'd kept ready for weeks, and handed it over. Inside were the permits, receipts, and a copy of the HOA's own bylaws with the relevant section highlighted in neon yellow. Richard flipped through the pages, his frown deepening with each turn. Karen was practically vibrating beside him. "Don't listen to him. He built this on purpose to hurt me. This is sabotage. You have to fine him. Richard, he's in violation." Richard sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Karen, did you drive through his fence?" Karen blinked, stunned that he would even ask. "That's not the point. He shouldn't have built something so dangerous." "That is the point," I cut in smoothly. "That fence is on my property. It's legal. It matches the community aesthetic. And I have security camera footage of her plowing through it. Would you like me to show it to everyone here?" I tapped the phone in my pocket. I didn't even need to pull it out. The threat alone was enough. The neighbors murmured eagerly, some holding up their own phones, already filming this HOA soap opera like it was the season finale of their favorite drama. Karen's jaw dropped. For once, she was speechless. Richard cleared his throat. "Mark is correct. Homeowners are allowed to reinforce their fences as long as they maintain outward appearance. And Karen, if you've been driving through his property..." "He provoked me," Karen blurted, her voice shrill. "He's been targeting me, setting me up. This whole thing is entrapment." The word entrapment nearly made me laugh out loud. She sounded like a criminal caught on a sting operation, not a suburban tyrant who thought she could drive wherever she pleased. "Entrapment," I said, raising an eyebrow. "No one forced you to aim 2 tons of SUV at my fence, Karen. That was all you." The crowd chuckled again. Someone whispered, "She's really losing it." Karen whirled on them, shouting, "Shut up, all of you, this is harassment." But the more she screamed, the less power she seemed to have. For once, the neighbors weren't cowering, they were enjoying the show. Richard finally raised his hand for silence. "Enough. Karen, I'll need a written statement from you. Mark, I'll review your documents in detail, but at first glance everything looks compliant." Compliant. The sweetest word I'd ever heard. Karen's face turned crimson. She stomped her foot like a toddler, denied candy. "This isn't over. You'll regret this, Mark. You'll all regret this." But even as she ranted, the authority had slipped from her voice. She wasn't the queen anymore, she was the jester, and the whole neighborhood was laughing. I leaned toward her, lowering my voice just enough for only her to hear. Funny thing about fences, Karen, sometimes they keep people out, sometimes they keep people in. Either way, yours just trapped you. Her eyes widened, lips trembling with rage, but she had no comeback. Not this time. As Richard walked away with my paperwork, neighbors clapped me on the shoulder, whispering things like, "About time someone stood up to her, and well played, Mark." For the first time, I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the man who had turned the tables. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. No, she'd come back swinging. But for now I savored the victory. The queen had been dethroned. The wrecked Range Rover didn't stay a private embarrassment for long. By Monday morning, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. You couldn't walk past the coffee shop on the corner without hearing snippets. Did you see the video? She really thought she could win against a fence. Best HOA drama since the pool incident of 2019. And oh yes, there were videos. At least half a dozen neighbors had captured the crash from different angles, and clips were already circulating in group chats on Facebook, even on TikTok. One of them even set it to dramatic opera music, and I'm not ashamed to admit I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. Karen, of course, was furious. She tried to do damage control, storming around with her head held high, barking at anyone who so much as chuckled in her direction. But the more she raged, the more powerless she looked. The image of her stumbling out of her mangled SUV thorns stuck to her blouse had burned itself into everyone's memory. By midweek, the insurance adjuster showed up. A short man in a crisp suit, clipboard in hand, he circled the Range Rover which still sat in Karen's driveway like a monument to her hubris, clicking his tongue. I watched from my porch, coffee mug in hand, trying not to look too obvious. Karen was right there beside him, gesturing wildly toward my fence. "He did this, he built it like a trap. You have to mark it as vandalism so I can file the claim." The adjuster raised an eyebrow. "Vandalism, ma'am, with respect. It looks like you drove your vehicle into a reinforced fence." Karen's voice shot up an octave. "He tricked me, he built it to cause damage." The adjuster crouched down, ran his hand along the bent metal undercarriage and sighed. "Ma'am, your policy doesn't cover intentional trespass. And from what I hear, this isn't the first time you've done this." I nearly spit out my coffee. Insurance adjusters talk to people, people talk to neighbors. And neighbors, oh, they'd been waiting for this moment. Sure enough, by the end of the day, Mrs. Jenkins from across the street was chatting with the adjuster, waving her hands as she recounted the countless times she'd seen Karen cut across my property. Then Mr. Lopez chimed in, describing how his kids had to stop playing in my yard because Karen's SUV was a constant hazard. Testimony after testimony piled up, and soon it wasn't just gossip, it was evidence. Karen's little empire of intimidation crumbled faster than that bumper. At the next HOA meeting, she tried to reassert control. She marched in with her usual designer outfit, though the scratches on her arms were still faintly visible. She slammed her binder down on the table and demanded action against me. "This man is a menace," she declared, pointing at me like she was accusing me of treason. "He deliberately sabotaged his fence to cause damage. He's a danger to the community." I simply opened my folder again, sliding across the receipts, bylaws, and just for fun, a USB stick with the footage from my security cameras. "Everything I did was legal," I said calmly, "and here's proof of exactly what happened." Karen drove into my property. Again. The murmurs in the room were deafening. I glanced around and saw neighbors nodding, some even smirking. A few months ago, no one would have dared cross her, but now they smelled blood in the water. Richard, the HOA president, adjusted his glasses. "Karen, based on the evidence, it appears Mark has acted within his rights. Furthermore, repeated trespassing is itself a violation of HOA rules." Karen's jaw dropped. "You're taking his side. After everything I've done for this community," someone from the back piped up. "Yeah, like fining us for leaving holiday lights up too long." Laughter rippled through the room. Karen tried to shout over them, but the tide had turned. Her allies on the board shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to go down with her sinking ship. She wasn't the queen anymore. She was a liability. And then came the cherry on top. A letter from the insurance company circulated among the board, stating that Karen's claim was being denied due to negligent and repeated trespass. Worse, they flagged her account for potential fraud because she'd initially reported it as vandalism. The look on her face when that was read aloud, priceless. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, and let the silence stretch before I said, "Funny how rules work when you actually follow them." The neighbors chuckled again. This time, no one hit it. Karen sputtered, tried to rally, but the more she spoke, the more ridiculous she sounded. The woman who once silenced a room with a glare was now being openly mocked by the very people she used to lord over. Every testimony, every laugh, every shake of the head stripped away another layer of her authority. By the end of the meeting, Richard closed his folder and said flatly, "This board will not be pursuing action against Mark. In fact, we'll need to discuss your conduct further, Karen." Her cheeks burned crimson. She grabbed her binder, hissed at me under her breath, something about regret and lawsuits, and stormed out heels, clicking furiously against the floor. I watched her go, a slow smile spreading across my face. Because this wasn't just about a car anymore. It wasn't just about a fence. Karen had built her power on intimidation, on silencing dissent, on bending the rules until they broke. But now the rules were bending back, and the community that once feared her was starting to laugh at her instead. And there's no coming back from that. If there's one thing I learned about Karen Whitmore, it's that humiliation doesn't humble her, it feeds her rage. After the insurance debacle and the HOA meeting where she was essentially hung out to dry, she walked around the neighborhood like a volcano ready to blow. Her usual smug air was gone, replaced by an almost frantic energy. She barked at delivery drivers for parking too long, scolded kids for riding bikes on the sidewalk, and snapped at anyone who dared greet her with anything less than reverence. But the neighborhood had changed. People weren't afraid anymore. Instead of scurrying away, they smirked. They whispered. They pulled out their phones. And every sideways glance, every chuckle pushed Karen closer to the edge. It finally happened on a hot Thursday afternoon. I was out front watering the lawn, enjoying the quiet, when I heard the unmistakable growl of her Range Rover's backup engine. She pulled out of her driveway, not toward the grocery store, not toward the community center. No, she came straight for me. Her SUV screeched to a halt right in front of my yard. She climbed out, face-red sunglasses askew, and stomped across the grass. "This is your fault," she screeched, pointing at me as if the world was waiting for her to deliver a final verdict. I set down the hose and raised an eyebrow. "Karen, you've been saying that for weeks. You might want to come up with some new material." Her hands shook. Her lips trembled. And then in one swift motion she marched over to my mailbox, the sturdy government-issued one I'd had since I bought the house, and ripped it clean out of the ground. Concrete base and all. For a moment time froze. The sight was almost surreal. There she stood, clutching my mailbox like a trophy dirt, and concrete crumbling from the base, her chest heaving like she'd just slain a dragon. And then reality hit her along with everyone else. Gasps erupted from across the street. Curtains twitched. Phones came out. Within seconds, at least 3 neighbors were recording. Mrs. Jenkins shouted, "That's a federal offense, you lunatic." Karen spun around, eyes wild. "He deserved it. He's been tormenting me. He's making a mockery of this neighborhood." I couldn't help myself. I smiled, calm as ever. "Karen, you just committed a federal crime, in broad daylight, on camera. Congratulations." She blinked, her grip tightening on the mailbox. "No, I was provoked. This is self-defense." Before I could even respond, flashing blue and red lights lit up the street. 2 squad cars rolled up, sirens cutting through the summer air. Apparently someone had called 911 the moment they saw her storm out of her SUV. The officers stepped out, hands resting casually near their belts. One of them, a tall woman with mirrored sunglasses, looked from Karen to the mangled mailbox in her hands. "Ma'am," she said flatly, "is there a reason you're holding a federal mailbox?" Karen froze, caught like a deer in headlights. He set me up," she sputtered, pointing at me again. "He's been harassing me. This is entrapment." The officer tilted her head. "Ma'am, destroying a mailbox is a federal crime. You're under arrest." Gasps turned into cheers. Neighbors clapped. Someone even whistled. And Karen, she shrieked as the officers moved in, dropping the mailbox with a heavy thud. "You can't do this to me. I'm on the HOA board. I'll have your badges." The officer didn't even flinch. She pulled out the cuffs with a metallic click. "Ma'am, place your hands behind your back." Karen flailed, screeching about her rights, about conspiracies, about how the neighborhood was out to get her, but it didn't matter. Within seconds, her wrists were cuffed and she was being led to the squad car while the entire cul-de-sac filmed the spectacle. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. As they pushed her into the back seat, she locked eyes with me through the window. Her face was a mask of fury, tears mixing with mascara lips curled into a snarl. She mouthed, "This isn't over," but we both knew it was. Because this wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. This was the law. HOA bylaws might bend, insurance companies might hedge, but federal crimes, that's the end game. As the squad cars drove off mailbox, still lying in the dirt like a slain monument, neighbors gathered around me clapping me on the back. Jenkins grinned, ear to ear. "Mark, I've lived here 30 years and I've never seen justice so sweet." I chuckled, shaking my head. Funny how sometimes all it takes is a fence and a mailbox to bring down an empire. The neighborhood erupted in laughter. Kids cheered. Phones buzzed as footage spread faster than wildfire. And me, I stood there, arms folded, watching the flashing lights disappear down the street, savoring the moment I'd been waiting for. Karen had finally lost. Not just her car, not just her reputation, but her crown. And the neighborhood, it would never be the same. Karen's arrest was the talk of the neighborhood for weeks. You'd think people would eventually get bored, but no, this wasn't just gossip. It was a saga, the downfall of a tyrant, and folks couldn't stop replaying it. Every time I walked down the street, someone would stop me to relive the moment. "Did you see her face when the cuffs clicked? I still can't believe she ripped out a mailbox. That's going viral for sure." And viral it did go. By the following week, footage of her meltdown had made its way online. Millions of views. Headlines on local news blogs. HOA board member arrested for mailbox meltdown. Even the city paper ran a column about the dangers of HOA power trips. For once, Karen's fame wasn't self-declared. It was earned, and not in the way she liked. Of course, her arrest wasn't the end of it. If anything, it was just the beginning of her real punishment. HOA convened an emergency meeting the very next week. For once, it wasn't me in the hot seat. No, this time the board members sat stiffly while Richard read aloud the charges: destruction of property, attempted insurance fraud, trespassing, and of course the big one, tampering with a federal mailbox. Karen wasn't present, of course. She was too busy lawyering up and screaming about conspiracies. But the board didn't need her there to make their decision. They voted unanimously. Karen was stripped of her board position, banned from ever holding office in the HOA again. The news spread like wildfire. I caught snippets from passing neighbors. "Finally, we can plant flowers without her approval, and guess we won't be getting any more of those threatening letters about garbage cans." Relief was in the air. It was like the neighborhood had collectively exhaled for the first time in years. But the punishments didn't stop at HOA politics. Her insurance company officially denied her claim, citing negligence and misrepresentation. Her premiums skyrocketed. Repairing the Range Rover was going to cost tens of thousands out of pocket. Then came the fines, city citations for reckless driving, HOA penalties for property destruction, legal fees piling higher than the fence she hated so much. And the neighbors, oh, they weren't forgiving. People she once ordered around now avoided her. Friends stopped coming by. Her so-called allies on the board wouldn't even make eye contact. She became a pariah in her own kingdom, walking the streets with her head down, sunglasses, hiding eyes that once glared with superiority. It all came to a head a month later, when the for sale sign went up in front of her house. Big red letters, price reduced. I'll admit, I popped a bottle of champagne that night. Quietly, of course. I wasn't about to throw a parade. But watching Karen pack up her oversized SUV with boxes, slamming doors, muttering curses under her breath, it was better than fireworks. As for me, I rebuilt the fence one final time, not because it needed it, but because I wanted to make a statement. I sanded the boards smooth, painted them bright white, and hung a custom wooden plaque on the section where Karen's car had met its fate. Burned into the wood in neat block letters were the words, "Karen's last crash." Neighbors loved it. They laughed, took photos, shared it around. It became a symbol not just of my little victory, but of the community finally standing up to her tyranny. For once, the HOA didn't find me. In fact, Richard himself stopped by, shook my hand, and muttered, "Good work, Mark. You did what the rest of us couldn't." And I'll admit, it felt good. Vindicating. I wasn't just the guy with the broken fence anymore. I was the guy who beat Karen at her own game and did it legally, publicly, and permanently. But beyond the jokes, beyond the satisfaction, there was something else. A lesson. Because the truth is, Karen's downfall wasn't about fences or bylaws or even cars. It was about arrogance. About what happens when someone believes they're above the rules, untouchable, until reality smacks them in the face, or in this case, in the front bumper. Karen learned the hard way that entitlement has consequences. And the rest of the neighborhood learned that sometimes all it takes is one person standing firm, one fence standing tall to change everything. At the end of the day, this story isn't really about a car wreck or a mailbox or even Karen herself. It's about what happens when someone abuses power and how patience, persistence, and a little creativity can turn the tables. I could have lost my temper months earlier. I could have yelled, cursed, maybe even gotten myself into real trouble. But instead, I waited. I studied the rules, I played the long game, and when the moment came, Karen walked straight into her own trap. That's the thing about people who think the rules don't apply to them, they create their own downfall. They get so blinded by arrogance that they can't see the wall in front of them even when it's painted bright white. For those of you watching, maybe you've dealt with your own Karen. Maybe it wasn't an HOA tyrant, it could have been a boss, a neighbor, even a family member who thought they were untouchable. Remember this, you don't always have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes the smartest revenge is simply standing firm, following the rules, and letting the other person trip over their own pride. So tell me in the comments, have you ever dealt with someone like Karen? How did you handle it? And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button because there are plenty more tales of HOA chaos, karmic payback, and poetic justice coming your way. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's next.